I saw my mother burn alive in the bombing. Even now, I can still smell that night when it all began. It's not a metaphor, not a poetic figure of speech I found to try to translate the pain into words others could bear to hear. It's the literal, physical memory that clings to my nostrils and burns my lungs every time I close my eyes. Even now, 60 years later, sitting on this creaky porch in a sleepy town in rural Maine, the smell of that night in Cleveland, the smell of burning pine, of the plaster crumbling into dust, of the wool of the rug my grandmother wove, overlaying it all, the sweet, horrible odor of human flesh cooking in the flame, the smell of my mother. Before that sound, that flash, that smell, the night was just another ordinary two. I was 9 years old, and the world was limited to the warmth of the kitchen, where my mother, Sarah, hummed some random tune as she prepared the apple pie crust for the next. The scent of cinnamon and sugar hung in the air, a sweet, sure promise of normalcy. My father, John, was in the living room, listening to the news on the radio, his brow furrowed with the worry all adults carry these days. A tension I, in my innocence, couldn't comprehend. To me, the war was just a whispered word, a map with colored pins in my father's office, something distant that happened to other people in other places. The first sound wasn't the explosion, but a high-pitched, rising whistle, a tear in the fabric of the night sky that made my father jump from his armchair and scream for us to run to the basement. But there wasn't time. The universe shattered in a white flash that engulfed the world, followed by a crash that wasn't a sound you hear with your ears, but a force you feel in your bone. A shockwave that threw me against the kitchen wall like a rag doll. The air filled with dust and darkness, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise itself. It was a dull, heavy silence, as if the world were holding its breath. And then the fire began. It began with a crackle, a small orange glow licking at the torn curtain, then grew with a ravenous hunger, devouring our home, our life, our memory. I was trapped under a wooden beam, my leg crushed, and all I could do was... The scent of cinnamon was replaced by the acrid smell of smoke. I screamed for my mother, for my father, but my voice was a thread lost in the rising roar of the flame. That was when I saw her, or what my terrified mind registered as her. A silhouette dancing in the heart of the inferno that was our kitchen, shrouded in a blanket of orange and red. There wasn't a scream I could hear outside, just the insane crackling of the wood and the sound of our piano in the living room, its strings snapping one by one in the heat, emitting dissonant, ghostly notes. The soundtrack to my loss. That smell never left me. It became the ghost that haunted me. Sometimes a neighbor lights a fireplace, or someone burns leaves in the yard, and for a second, I'm back there, a 9-year-old boy trapped under the rubble, forced to inhale the cremation of the woman who gave me life. They say time heals all wounds, but it's not true. Time only teaches you to live with the scars, to build a life round the hole left. But the smell, is a wound that never heals, a sensory memory that instantly transports me to the epicenter of my pain, to the night the sky fell and hell rose to find us. My name is Samuel Miller, and most people who know me today here in Augusta, Maine, see me as just a quiet old man who tends his garden with an almost obsessive. They see me as Sam, the veteran who doesn't talk much about the war, the widow who sits on the porch and watches the sunset as if waiting for something that never comes. I'm 84 years old, and my body bears the map of a long life, the wrinkled skin, the age-stained hands, and the left leg that creaks and aches with every change of weather. A constant reminder of that wooden beam. But before I was that old man, before I was Private Miller, registration 3589711 of the 3rd Infantry Division, and long before that night that tore me in two, I was just Sam, the son of John and Sarah Miller, resident of 24 Elm Street in a working-class neighborhood of Cleveland, Ohio. A 9-year-old boy whose universe was as small and safe as our backyard. Our house wasn't large, but to me it was a castle, a 2-story clapboard building, painted a blue that was already peeling under the Midwestern sun. I remember the creak of the 3rd floor of the stairs, a sound my mother said was the friendly ghost of the house warning us not to run. I remember the floral wallpaper in the upstairs hallway, slightly faded by the sunlight streaming through the window, and how I used to trace the outlines of the small roses with my finger while waiting for my father to come home from work. The living room was his domain. It smelled of pipe tobacco and old newspaper. In the center of the room stood his worn leather chair, his handprints on the wooden arm, where he sat each night to read the Cleveland Plain Dealer and listen to the news of the war in Europe on the large wooden radio that was our portal to the world. My father, John, was a man of few words but an immense presence. He worked in the steel mill, turning mountains of metal into parts for the ships and tanks that were shipped across the ocean. His hands were thick and stained with grease that never completely washed away no matter how much he scrubbed them. Soap. But those hands were the gentlest I'd ever known. They were the hands that taught me to tie my shoes, that pushed me on the swing he built from the old tree in the backyard, and that rested on my shoulder with a comforting weight when I had nightmares. He didn't talk about the fear the radio news instilled in him, but I saw it in his eyes, in the way his jaw clenched when he heard the names of distant cities like Pearl Harbor or Dunkirk. He tried to shield us from the ugliness of the world, building a fortress of normalcy within the walls of our home. But the heart of that fortress, the soul of our Elm Street home, was my mother, Sarah. If my father was the silent, strong structure, my mother was the light and warmth that filled every room. I remember her in the kitchen, almost always there, with an apron tied around her waist and a trail of flour on her cheek. The kitchen was her kingdom, and it smelled of bread baking, of beef stew simmering on the stove, of cinnamon, of vanilla. She had a soft voice and hummed as she cooked, simple melodies that seemed to weave an extra layer of peace into the air. She was the one who tended the front garden, planting vibrant red geraniums that were the pride of our street. She was the one who mended my overalls when I tore them playing soldier with my best friend, David, and it was she who sat on the edge of my bed every night, reading me stories of knights and dragons, her voice guiding me away from the shadows of the real world and into a peaceful sleep. Life before that night was a tapestry of small rituals and sensation. It was the sound of the milk truck on summer morning, the smell of freshly cut grass, the taste of the peanut butter and jelly sandwich my mother made for my school. It was the feel of the leather baseball hitting my glove, the shouts of my friends echoing down the street as the sun set, painting the sky orange and purple. The war, for us children, was a distant adventure. We collected ration stamps, participated in school scrap metal drive, and listened to the adults talk in somber tones about something called the... But it was abstract. The real enemy, for me, was Mrs. Gable, the grumpy neighbor who complained when our ball landed in her rose bed. The real battle was convincing my mother to let me stay up a little later to listen to my favorite radio show. The world was made of simple certainty. The sun would rise. My mother would be in the kitchen. My father would come home from work, and the night would be quiet. This was my life. A small, ordinary life, perfect in its predictability. A life that breathed to the rhythm of my mother's heart. A life built on the unshakable foundation that nothing bad could happen as long as we were together. Inside our blue house on Elm Street, it was this certainty, this sacred innocence, that the fire consumed that night. Along with everything else, the fire that consumed my house and my mother was infernally hot. A heat that seemed to melt the very air. But what came afterward? What I felt when a firefighter finally pulled me from the rubble and deposited me on the cold sidewalk across the street was a cold unlike anything I had ever known. It was a cold that didn't come from the Ohio night, but from within, a cold that settled into my bones the instant I realized the warmth of my life had been extinguished forever. Wrapped in a rough wool blanket that smelled of mothballs and smoke, I became a spectator to my own disaster. My teeth chattered uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the shock that coursed through my body in waves. My leg throbbed with a deep, dull ache, but it was a distant pain, a background noise to the cacophony of silence, and the hungry roar of the fire that still devoured what remained of 24 Elm Street. I was just another soot-stained figure on a street full of them. People ran, cried, hugged each other. Neighbors, their faces streaked with tears and panic, tried to help, offering water, blanket, words of comfort that were lost in the chaos. But no one really saw me. They saw a wounded boy, a victim, a problem to be solved. They didn't see Sammy, the universe that existed just hours ago, where I was the center of my parents' world, had contracted and disappeared, and I was spat out, anonymous and irrelevant. I searched the crowd for my father's face. Every tall man who passed, every shadow that moved with purpose, made my heart leap with desperate hope. He must be somewhere, organizing, helping, looking for him. He was John Miller, the man who fixed everything. Surely he would fix this. But he never appeared. Later, I was told they found him near the front door, his body shielding the entrance, as if he could have stopped the bomb with his own willpower. In that moment, however, I knew only his absence, a hole opening beside me, as vast and terrible as the burning house in front of me. A civil defense man, wearing a white helmet and a weary face, lifted me into his arms. The movement made my leg explode with pain, and a moan escaped my lips. "Easy, kid. We're going to get you to safety," he said, his voice husky and impersonal. There was no kindness in it, just the weary efficiency of someone who had seen too much that night. I was placed in the back of a military truck along with several others. A woman beside me sobbed, clutching a picture frame with broken glass. An older man simply stared into space, his eyes unseeing. No one spoke. What was there to say? We were united not by community, but by a shared and unspeakable loss, a brotherhood of the dispossessed. The safe place was the gymnasium of the local elementary, the same one where I'd learned multiplication tables and drawn turkeys with the outline of my hand on Thanksgiving. But the place was unrecognizable. The basketball hoops were still there, but the court was covered in makeshift mattresses and cots, rows and rows of organized misery. The air was heavy, heavy with the smell of sweat, antiseptic, fear, and the omnipresent stench of smoke that clung to us. Sound echoed in that enormous space the stifled cries of adults, the high-pitched wails of babies, and the constant hum of Red Cross workers and volunteers trying to impose some order on the chaos. I was handed over to a woman in uniform. She had a kind face, but her eyes were hollow with exhaustion. She sat me on a cot, examined my leg with a clinical touch, and wrapped it more tightly in a bandage. And then came the interrogation, the first of many humiliations. Clipboard in hand, she began asking the question, "What's your name, dear?" "Samuel Miller." "How old are you?" "Samuel, 9. "Where are your parents?" The question hung in the noisy air of the gymnasium. My lips trembled. The words wouldn't come out. "My mother," I began, my voice breaking. She was in the kitchen." The woman didn't hesitate. She simply made a note on her form. "And your father?" "I don't know. I can't find him," I whispered. Another note. She didn't hug me. She didn't tell me everything would be okay. She simply moved on to the next line of her questionnaire. In that moment, I understood. My tragedy, the event that tore my world apart, was to her a series of boxes to be ticked, a name on a list of orphans and missing people. My pain was just a statistic. Later, another volunteer passed by handing out food. She carried a large metal cauldron, and the smell emanating from it made my stomach churn. It was a thin soup, with a few chunks of potato and carrot floating in a watery, colorless broth. She served it in a tin bowl and handed it to me along with a piece of dry bread. I looked at the meal, and a wave of anger and sadness so intense I nearly choked. Hours before, the world had smelled of apple pie and cinnamon. The world had tasted like my mother's stew, rich and warm, made with love. Now, the world tasted like that soup. The taste of charity, the taste of loss. It was the taste of loneliness. I didn't eat. I just sat there on the hard, holding a hot bowl. As the liquid cooled and became even more undrinkable, I was hungry, in pain, cold. But the humiliation of being reduced to this, to an anonymous orphan in a noisy gymnasium, fed a pauper's soup, was a pain deeper than any other. That night, among dozens of strangers, I learned the cruelest lesson of my life. When you lose everything, the first thing the world takes from you, after your family and your home, is your name. You become just another mouth to feed, another body to shelter, another number on a piece of paper. The days I spent in the school gym blurred together in a blur of pain, confusion, that watery, grey soup. But as terrible as it was, there was a strange sense that it was temporary, a waiting room between the life I'd lost and whatever came next. I still didn't understand that horror isn't just the explosive event that destroys your life. Horror is what grows in the ruins, slowly and silently, like a poisonous mold. My horror had a name, St. Jude Orphanage for Boys. I was taken there on a cold morning, when the sky was the same color as the soup I refused to. It was an imposing building of red brick darkened by the city's soot, surrounded by a high wrought iron fence that seemed less like protection from the outside world and more like a guarantee that no me inside would escape. The windows were high and narrow, like those of a prison, and the whole place reeked of a smell that hit me the moment I stepped inside, a mixture of carbolic disinfectant, boiled cabbage, and an ancient sadness ingrained in the very wall. I was greeted by a woman named Sister Agnes. She was tall and thin, and her face seemed carved from stone, devoid of any trace of softness or compassion. She took the small bundle of donated clothes I carried, inspected them with a look of disdain, and tossed them into a basket. "You won't need these," she said, her voice as cold and hard as the stone floor beneath my feet. "Here, everyone is equal. Equality at S. Jude meant the annihilation of who you were." I was stripped naked, washed with a stiff brush and cold water that ripped my skin, and dressed in the uniform, itchy grey wool pants, a rough coat, and heavy leather shoes that didn't fit properly. My name, Samuel, was also confiscated to Sister Agnes and the other caregiver. I was simply Miller, one surname in a long line of other surnames, an extra body to occupy a bed. Life at St. Jude was governed by the sound of a metal bell. The bell woke us before dawn, in the cold darkness of the dormitory. The bell sent us to the icy chapel, where we were to kneel and pray, though I no longer knew to whom or what I was praying. The bell called us to the dining hall, a large, noisy room where we ate thin porridge for a breakfast and cabbage stew for lunch and dinner, always in absolute silence. Any whisper was punished with the loss of their already meager ration of bread. The bell sent us to the classroom, where we learned from old, tattered books, or to the workshop, where our small hands were put to work, repairing furniture or polishing the endless floor. The bell dictated every second of our existence, stealing our ability to think, to feel, to remember. It was a mechanism designed to break us, to turn boys into obedient cogs in a machine of despair. The dormitory was a silent battlefield. 40 iron beds lined up in perfect rows, each with a thin mattress and a single grey blanket. At night, after the lights went out, the true sound of St. Jude emerged. It wasn't the sound of sleeping boys, but the sound of muffled sobs into pillows, the sound of teeth grinding in anger or fear, the sound of dry coughs echoing in the vast, dark space. We were 40 boys, each of us carrying the ghost of a family lost to war, to disease, to poverty. We were together, yet terribly alone. In this environment, kindness was a weakness to be exploited. The older, stronger boys ruled through fear. A stolen extra loaf of bread, an accidental push on the stairs, the theft of the only personal thing you managed to hide from, a small mother-of-pearl button from my mother's coat that I found in the pocket of my old clothes before they were taken. I learned to make myself invisible, walking with my head down, not making eye contact, never showing emotion. The face I saw in the dirty bathroom mirror wasn't Sammy's anymore. It was a stranger's face, with eyes that had seen too much and learned to feel nothing. The boy's cruelty was a reflection of the cruelty of the adults who watched over us. Sister Agnes was the embodiment of the world's indifference. Once, a younger boy named Peter, whose father had died at Anzio, began to cry uncontrollably during dinner, a high-pitched, desperate sound that shattered the oppressive silence. Sister Agnes didn't go to comfort him. She walked slowly to the table, grabbed him by the arm with surprising strength, and dragged him out of the dining hall. Later, we heard his screams coming from the reflection closet, a dark, windowless broom closet in the basement where the boys were locked for hours, sometimes for a whole day. When Peter returned, he no longer cried. He did nothing. He just stared straight ahead, his eyes like to empty well. They hadn't fixed his pain. They had killed it, along with whatever else remained inside him. The war wasn't just a distant memory for us. It was a hungry presence that stalked the gates of St. Jude. Every week, we read the news on the bulletin board. lists of the dead, maps of battles with exotic and terrifying names like Normandy, the Ardennes, Iwo Jima. For us, these weren't just places. They were the slaughterhouses that had swallowed our parents and older brother. Every now and then, an army officer would come to the orphanage. Boys who turned 17 were summoned to Sister Agnes's office. They left with a strange look in their eyes, a mixture of fear and dark pride. They were taken from our grey misery and thrust into a much greater misery, dressed in a different uniform, but sent to the same fate of obedience and annihilation. We saw many leave, few return, and those who did were never the same. The nights were the worst part. In that shared darkness, without the bell to distract her, memories came to haunt her. The smell of my mother in the kitchen, the sound of my father's laughter, the feel of my own soft pillow. Everything felt like a dream, a life lived by someone else. The only thing we had were the stories we whispered to each other when our caregivers couldn't hear, stories of our past lives, of our family. It was our way of keeping those memories alive, of fighting the oblivion Jude tried to impose on us. It was a small act of rebellion, of affirming that we existed, that we were loved. That's why I tell this story to you today. If you believe that memories like these deserve to be kept alive, that our story shouldn't be forgotten, leave a like to this story, letting me know you're listening. Subscribe to the channel so that more voices like mine, which have been silenced for so long, aren't lost to the indifference of time. Every story shared is a small flame lit against the darkness, a proof that we were here. I spent 6 years in St. Jude, 6 years of boiled cabbage, hands cracked from cold and work, and a soul slowly turning to stone. The ground beneath my feet no longer shook with balm, but the horror had found a new way to manifest itself. It was no longer a sudden, violent attack. It was a slow, steady erosion. It was the sound of the bell, the taste of the porridge, the empty look on Peter's face. It was the growing understanding that I hadn't emerged from the fire that night. The fire had merely changed shape. It no longer burned my skin, but burned from within, slowly consuming any vestige of hope, any memory of who I was. True horror, I discovered, is not sudden death from the sky. It is the slow death of the soul, day after grey day, in a place where love is a foreign word and hope is a punishable offense. I was on a production line, being molded and hardened, prepared for the only escape the world offered boys like us, war. The machine that took my parents was just waiting for me to be old enough to come get me too. In the grey, hopeless world of St. Jude Orphanage, where kindness was a worthless currency and survival depended on how quickly you learned to shut yourself off from the world, I made the mistake of making a friend. His name was Daniel. He arrived about 6 months after me, a thin, pale boy from Boston, with frightened blue eyes and a chronic cough that shook him at night. His parents weren't victims of the bomb. His father was a sailor, and his ship was sunk by a submarine in the Atlantic, and his mother, without him, simply withered away, taken by pneumonia the following winter. Daniel was different from the rest of us. While most boys at St. Jude built walls round themselves, he carried a fragility that should have made him a prime target for bullies, but somehow made him nearly invisible. He was quiet, not out of fear, but by nature. He didn't speak of his old life with the same bitter pain we did. He remembered it with a tenderness that seemed impossible to me. He was the only one who still knew how to hope. Our friendship blossomed in whispers in the darkness of the dormitory. After the lights went out and the only sound was muffled sobs, he would tell me about the smell of the sea in Boston, about how his father had taught him to tie sailors, about the taste of his mother's blueberry muffin, and I, in return, would break my own oath of silence and tell him about the smell of cinnamon in my mother's kitchen, about my father's leather armchair, about the creak of the third plank of the staircase. We were archaeologists of our own lost lives, unearthing precious memories and sharing them like a secret treasure. He was the keeper of my humanity. With him, I wasn't Miller, the silent survivor. I was Sammy again. He had an imagination that Sister Agnes hadn't been able to kill. He would look at the damp patches on the dormitory ceiling and see maps of fantastical land. He would see the face of a king in the bark of a tree in the courtyard. He taught me to see a little color in our grey world. Because of him, I stole an apple from the kitchen, the first time I'd ever purposefully broken the rules, and we shared it behind the boiler in the basement, the warmest place in the entire oven. That sweet, forbidden taste, shared in the darkness, was the happiest moment I'd had in years. Daniel was my only ray of light, proof that my soul hadn't completely frozen. And that's why the system took him from me. The horror, as always, began subtly. It came with winter, a particularly brutal Ohio winter that turned the outside world into a landscape of ice and steel. Inside St. Jude, the cold was a physical enemy. Our thin blankets offered no protection, and the central heating was only turned on for 2 hours in the late afternoon. Daniel's cough worsened. At first, it was just the same old hacking cough, but then it became deep and wet, a hollow sound that left him breathless. He developed a fever, and his pale skin took on a grayish hue. I did what I could. I gave him my piece of bread when he was too weak to eat the stew. At night, I spread my blanket over his, shivering in my own bed, but hoping the double layer might offer him some warmth. "You'll catch a cold, Sammy," he whispered hoarsely. "It doesn't matter," I replied. "You need to get better." But he wasn't getting better. He grew worse every day. After a week, he could barely get out of bed. That's when fear, a cold, creeping fear, overcame my dread of Sister Agnes. During breakfast formation, I broke ranks and ran to her, standing in front of her, an unthinkable affront to the order of St. Jude. "Sister, please," I begged, my voice. "It's Daniel. He's very sick. He needs a doctor." She looked me up and down, her small, hard eyes betraying no trace of emotion. "Get back in line, Miller," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "His illness is weakness of spirit. Discipline and prayer are the only medicine he needs. But he's burning with fever. He can barely breathe." I insisted, desperation making me reckless. Her hand moved faster than I could see, and the crack of the slap across my face echoed through the silent dining room. My cheek burned with pain and humiliation. I said, "Get back in line," she hissed. "If you defy me again, you'll spend 3 days in the reflection closet. The Collins boy will learn to be strong. Self-pity is a sin." I was defeated. I returned to my place, the red mark of his hand on my face, and an icy feeling of helplessness forming in my heart. That night, Daniel was delirious. He whispered of ships and the ocean, calling for his mother. I sat on the edge of his bed, holding his feverish hand, wiping his sweaty face with my sleeve. I felt like a lone guard in a besieged fortress, knowing the enemy had already breached the wall. In the early morning hours, when the darkness was deeper, his breathing became ragged, a ragged, painful sound. And then it stopped. There was a final sigh, a slight shudder, and then silence. Utter, terrible silence in the small space between our beds. I continued to hold his hand, feeling the warmth drain from it, until it was as cold as mine. I lay there, motionless, until the sound of the bell woke up. When the lights came on, the other boys saw it, but no one said anything. They looked away, a gesture of fear and perhaps a pity they dared not express. I called Sister Agnes. She came, looked at Daniel's body, and her face didn't change. "Rise for prayer," was all she said. 2 men came and took Daniel's body, wrapped in his own sheet. They carried him outside like a bag of dirty laundry. His mattress was removed, the bed frame wiped down with disinfectant. By dinner time, a new boy, just arrived, was already occupying Daniel's bed. He looked at me fearfully, and I stared at him blankly. To the world, to St. Jude, Daniel Collins had ceased to exist. There was no funeral, not a single word spoken in his memory in the chapel. He was simply erased. My mother's death was like an explosion that demolished the world. Daniel's death was a poison that seeped into me and rotted everything that remained inside. The bombing taught me that the world was violent. Daniel's death, through neglect, through cold indifference, taught me that the world didn't care. It didn't care if you lived, if you died, if you suffered. Your pain was an inconvenience. Your life was disposable. That night, after seeing the frightened face of the new boy in Daniel's bed, I took my mother's small mother-of-pearl box, the only thing I had of her, and buried it in the courtyard under a loose stone near them. I buried my last link to Sammy. The boy who believed in friendship and hope was dead, and in his place was Miller, a survivor. And Miller knew one thing for sure. In this world, you can't depend on anyone. The only way to survive is to never, ever care about anything again. At 17, the iron gates of St. Jude finally opened for me. It wasn't an act of liberation, but a triumph. A man from the United States, impeccably uniformed and with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, came with a clipboard, just like the Red Cross woman years before. My name was called. I traded a grey uniform for an olive green one, an oppressive dormitory for an equally oppressive barrack, and the tyranny of the chapel bell for the tyranny of the camp bugle. The world had told me, in every possible way, that I was disposable, and now it was giving me the chance to prove it on a much bigger scale. 8 months later, after training that felt more like an attempt to sandpaper away any shred of individuality I had left, I was on a ship, then a truck, and finally, with my feet in the snow of a place the maps called the Ardennes Forest in Belgium. December 1944. I was Private Miller, a rifleman in Baker Company, part of a defensive line everyone believed to be in a quiet sector of the war. The war, the veteran said, was almost over, but the forest didn't seem quiet. It seemed to be holding its breath. The cold was the first thing you noticed. It was a cold unlike any I'd ever felt. It wasn't the damp chill of the St. Jude basement, but a dry, biting cold that felt like it had teeth. It seeped through every layer of clothing, froze the metal of my M1 rifle to the point of burning best, and turned our breath into ghostly clouds that hovered and disappeared in the still air. The trees were gigantic, pines covered in a shroud of snow that absorbed all sound, creating a heavy, unbearable silence. It was like walking inside an empty, frozen cathedral, and we had the constant feeling that we were being watched by eyes we couldn't. The attack began in the early morning of December 16. It didn't begin with a gunshot, but with a sound that tore through the silence of the forest and instantly transported me back to the night I lost. It was a whistling sound, a high-pitched, rising cry in the dark sky, but this time it wasn't a single bomb. It was hundreds, tens of hundreds. We threw ourselves into our frozen trench, pathetic holes dug in the hard earth. As the world exploded, the ground didn't tremble. It heaved and rippled like the surface of the ocean in a storm. The explosions were so close and incessant that there were no longer individual sounds, just a continuous, deafening roar that vibrated inside my skull, rattling my teeth. With each impact, the earth pounded against my chest, knocking the air from my lungs. Fist-sized pieces of shrapnel whizzed through the air with the sound of an angry drum. Trees as thick as a man were snapped in half like twigs, their splinters flying in all directions like deadly spears. I huddled at the bottom of my trench, my head covered by my arm, my body shaking uncontrollably. I was no longer a soldier. I was a 9-year-old boy again, trapped under a beam, waiting for the fire to consume me. The smell of cordite and crushed pine was as overpowering as the smoke and burning flesh of my memory, and for a moment of absolute terror, I no longer knew where I was, what war one was fighting. When the bombardment finally subsided, the silence that followed was even more terrifying. And then we heard a new sound, a low, deep rumble, the sound of heavy metal crunching through snow and frozen undergrowth, the sound of engines. Our sergeant, a man named Costello who had fought in Africa, peered over the edge of the trench. His face, normally flushed and confident, was pale as wax. Hanses, he whispered, and the words seemed to freeze the air. They're coming. The first thing I saw were the ghostly lights dancing among the trees, then the silhouette, steel grey monsters, with black crosses painted on their sides, emerging from the morning mist like prehistoric beasts. And behind them came the infantry, men in long winter coats, moving with a discipline, frightening efficiency. Hell had begun again, but this time it was a personal hell. The air filled with the distinct sound of the German MG-42 machine gun, a canvas-ripping sound that seemed to never stop firing. Green and red tracer bullets crisscrossed the space between us, creating a deadly web. Our own return fire sounded pathetic in comparison. Thump, thump, thump off our Browning machine gun, the sharp crack of my gun. Beside me, and I were a boy named Peterson, no more than 8, raised his head for a second too long to fire. I heard the dull thud of a bullet hitting his helmet, then his skull. He fell back into the trench without a sound, have his face cut. Warm blood splashed onto the snow, a shocking red against the white. We were swallowed up by the wave. There were so many of them. Costello was cut in half by a burst of machine gun fire as he tried to run to the next position. I saw men screaming, men crying, men firing blindly until their clips emptied with the distinctive sound of ping-off. And then the tank was upon us. It loomed over the crest of our trench, blotting out the grey sky, a mountain of steel and power. The ground shook under its weight. I looked up at the long, dark barrel of its 88mm cannon, staring back at me like a cyclops' eye. Time stood still. In that instant, everything went silent in my head. I saw the frozen mud on its tracks, the scratch marks on its armor. The whole world shrank into that dark hole, and the absolute certainty that my life would end there, in that icy hole in Belgium. I closed my eyes. Private Miller disappeared. Orphan Miller disappeared. In my last second, I was Sammy again. I felt the heat of the fire, heard the crackle of the beams, smelled my mother. And I waited, but the cannon shot never came. Instead, I felt a crushing pressure and heard a deafening screech as the enormous mass of metal passed over my trench, inches from my head. The earth collapsed on me, partially burying me, but I was alive. Why hadn't he fired? Was he in a hurry? Didn't the gunner see me? Was it mercy? Or, more likely, was I considered so insignificant that it wasn't worth wasting a grenade? The same indifference that had killed Daniel had now saved me. By the time I finally managed to dig myself out, the main battle had already passed me by. The forest had become a slaughterhouse. The sound of fighting was more distant now. Round me, there was only silence and death. Bodies of Americans and Germans lay together in the snow, frozen statues in their final moments of agony. The snow was no longer white, but a stained canvas of red and black. The air smelled of blood and smoke. I was the only one standing in my small sector of the universe. I stood, shivering, not from the cold, but from an overload of adrenaline and terror that had nowhere to go. I survived, but as I stared at young Peterson's frozen, eyeless face, I realized the word survive was a lie. No one survives something like this. You just die differently. Part of you remains behind, frozen forever in the snow, beside your friend. What gets up and keeps walking is just a ghost, an echo, a man haunted by the inexplicable guilt of still breathing. The last echo of the last shot faded among the broken trees, and what remained was a silence unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was a presence. A heavy, dense silence that filled my ears, pressed against my skin, seemed to suck the very air from my lungs. During the bombardment and the battle, the noise was so total it became a kind of cocoon, a chaos that prevented you from thinking. But the silence forced you to see. And what I saw was a frozen hell. The world had been reduced to 3 colors, the white of the snow, the black of the charred trees and shell holes, and red. Red was everywhere, stains, puddles, splashes that painted the snow with the horrific story of the last moments of dozens of men. I stood for what could have been minutes or an hour, unable to move. The adrenaline that had kept me alive was now deserting, and in its place came a weariness that seemed to weigh down every cell of my body. It was a weariness of the soul. I looked at what was left of Private Peterson. He lay on his back, his eyes open to the grey, indifferent sky, a lone snowflake melting on his pale cheek. I should have felt something. Sadness. Anger. Fear. But I felt nothing. It was as if artillery had blasted every emotion out of me, leaving only a hollow, empty shell. I looked at his face, the face of a boy who, the night before, had shown me a crumpled photo of his girlfriend in Iowa, and all I could think was, his eyes are freezing. It was a clinical, distant thought, as if I were a doctor examining a body that had no connection to me. I knew I couldn't stay there. The cold, which I'd barely noticed during the fight, now returned with a vengeance, sinking its claws into me. My survival instinct, the only thing still working within me, told me to move. I began walking, aimlessly, just away from that pocket of carnage. Each step was an effort. My feet felt like lead. The scene round me was equipment was strewn everywhere, punctured helmets, rifles broken in half, torn backpacks with their contents letters, ration, spare socks spread across the snow like the entrails of a slaughtered animal, and there were the bodies. I passed them, Americans and German, sometimes lying just feet apart, mortal enemies who now shared the same icy stillness. At one point, I stumbled upon a young German soldier. He couldn't have been more than 16. His glasses were broken, and he clutched a photograph tightly in his gloved hand. Morbid curiosity made me look. It was a smiling woman holding a baby. Peterson's girlfriend. This German boy's wife and son. What was the difference? They were both dead in a foreign forest, thousands of miles from the ones they loved, victims of the same madness. The hatred I had felt just hours before, the primal instinct to kill or be killed, was gone. Looking at that boy, I didn't see a Nazi, an enemy. I saw myself. I saw Daniel, a frightened boy ripped from his home and thrown into a meat grinder. The war had ceased to be a struggle between good and evil. It had become simply the machine, and we were all just grains being ground by it. The silence of the forest was broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of my boots in the snow. And in that silence, I began to understand the nature of my loneliness. I had been alone when my mother died, surrounded by a crowd that didn't see my pain. I had been alone in St. Jude, surrounded by other lost boys, each locked in their own prison of sadness. But this was a different loneliness. It was an existential, cosmic loneliness. I was the only living thing in a world of the dead, a ghost walking through a cemetery. It was as if I had survived the end of the world and been left behind to witness the devastation. There was nowhere to go. The battle lines had shifted, broken, dissolved into chaos. I was lost, but strangely, this didn't terrify me. What could happen to me? Death. I had already looked into her eyes. Pain. I already felt a pain so deep that no physical wound could equal it. I kept walking, driven by an internal automaton. The sun, a pale, watery disk, began to sink, and the shadows of the broken trees stretched across the snow like skeletal fingers. The world was turning blue and purple, and the cold deepened. I knew that if I stopped, if I lay down to rest, I would freeze to death. And a part of me, a tired and broken part, wanted just that. It would be so easy, just to lie down and let the silence and the cold take me, join everyone else. But the automaton kept moving me one step, then the next, without purpose, without hope, just movement, because, in the end, that was all I had left, the echo of an instinct. I was not a hero. I was not a soldier. I was just an anomaly. A miscalculation of the machine, a body that should have been dead, but by some cosmic chance was still breathing. And in that infinite silence, I wondered if this was a blessing or the worst curse of all. I walked for 2 days in that frozen forest, an automaton driven only by instinct. I was found by a reconnaissance patrol, covered in ice, suffering from frostbite and barely able to say my own name. I was sent to a field hospital, then another in England, and finally back home. The war in Europe ended while I was still learning to feel my toes again. I arrived in a country that celebrated victory with parades and kisses in public squares. I returned to a world that wanted to turn the page, forget the blood and noise, and build a bright future. But I was a page that could not be turned. I was a ghost of the forest, haunted by silence, walking the sunny streets of America like a stranger in a foreign land. 4 years, I lived within that silence I brought with me from the Ardennes. I got a job in a sawmill, the physical, repetitive work keeping me sane, the noise of the saws drowning out the screams in my head. At night, however, the silence returned, and with it, the faces, Peterson, Costello, Daniel, my parent. I drank to fill the void, but alcohol only made it deeper. I was a man who had survived it all, but who didn't know how to live. Change didn't come like a ray of light, but like the slow, gradual rising of the sun. Her name was Eleanor. She was a waitress at the little diner where I drank my coffee every morning before work. She had kind eyes and didn't ask many questions. She saw what others didn't. not the war hero some wanted to see, nor the broken man I knew I was. She saw only a man who seemed to carry a heavy weight, and she didn't try to lift it from me. She simply sat beside me, silently, and helped me carry it. It was from her that I learned the hardest and most important lesson of my life. I spent my youth learning to be tough, to build walls, to feel nothing as a defense mechanism. Jude taught me that love led to pain. The Ardennes taught me that life was random and meaningless. Survival, in my mind, meant remaining numb. But Eleanor, with her quiet patience, taught me that true courage wasn't about facing enemy fire. It was about having the courage to feel again. The real battle of my life wasn't fought in the snow of Belgium, but within my own heart. The struggle to tear down the walls I'd built myself. It was terrifying. Loving Eleanor meant opening the door to the possibility of losing her, and loss was the ghost that defined me. But in taking the risk, I discovered something profound. The pain of losing Daniel wasn't a testament to love's weakness. It was proof of its strength. The pain I felt was the exact measure of how much our brief time together meant. Love isn't the absence of pain. It's what makes life worth the inevitable pain of loss. That was how I found my catharsis, my own reality. Not in God, not in country, not in some grand universal truth about war. I found it in the little thing. War taught me the value of what it destroys. After years of eating tasteless food from tin bowl, the simple taste of a homemade stew made by Eleanor was a blessing. After sleeping on the frozen ground, the warmth of a clean bed was the greatest luxury in the world. After living under the constant roar of death, the silence of a sleeping house, punctuated only by the soft breathing of my wife, later, my children, was no longer terrifying. It became the most beautiful music I had ever heard. I learned to honor the dead not by drowning in my grief, but by living the life they were denied. Every time I taught my son to ride a bike, I did it for my father, who never had the chance. Every time I comforted my daughter after a nightmare, I did it for my mother, whose comfort was stolen from me. And each time I sat in silence with a friend, sharing a moment of wordless understanding, I did so for Daniel. My life became my memorial. I realized I didn't survive by chance. Or maybe it was by chance. But what mattered wasn't why I survived, but what I did with the life I was given. Surviving wasn't just about breathing. It was about finding a purpose for that breath. My purpose became this, to be a witness, to bear witness to the fragile beauty of the world so many men, on both sides of that war, left behind. To bear witness to the fact that even after the worst kind of darkness, it's possible to find light again. Not because the darkness disappears, but because you learn to light a candle. My candle was my family. It was my garden. It was the work of my hand. The scars never went away. My leg still hurts when it rains. The smell of smoke still takes me back to that night in Cleveland. But the scars are no longer open wounds. They became part of my map. Proof that I've been to terrible places and found my way back. The final lesson, the learning I carry with me on this porch, is this: the world can and will break you. It will take away the people you love, destroy your home, crush your soul, and leave you alone in the cold. But the essence of being human isn't avoiding being broken. It's what you do with the pieces. You can leave them in the snow to freeze, or you can, with patience and courage and the help of a gentle hand, begin to put them back together. The new form will never be the same as the old. It will be stronger in some places, more fragile in others, but it will be yours. It will be proof not that you never fell, but that you rose. The sun is setting now. It paints the sky with the same orange and red hues that once colored the fire that devoured my house. But now I don't feel terror. I feel a deep calm. My garden, which I've tended for over 50, is quiet. The flowers Eleanor and I planted continue to bloom year after year. My wife passed away a decade ago. My children have children of their own, and the house is now filled with a different kind of silence. It's not the heavy, eerie silence of the Ardennes forest, nor the oppressive silence of St. Jude. It's a peaceful silence, full of echoes of a life well lived. A life I never expected to have. People sometimes ask me how I got over it all. They use that word, get over, as if memory were a disease you cure yourself, as if the past were a hill you climb and leave behind. They don't understand. You never let go. You don't get over it. You learn to carry it. The ghosts of my past haven't gone away. They've simply changed. They no longer haunt me in the shadows. They walk beside me in the daylight. When I see my grandson, with his curious blue eyes, I see a glimmer of Daniel and his tireless imagination. When I smell bread baking in my daughter's house, for a brief moment, my mother is in the kitchen. Private Peterson, Sergeant Costello, all the nameless faces in the snow. They are there. They are in the appreciation I have for every sunrise, in the gratitude I feel for every warm meal, in the way I hold a loved one's hand a little tighter. They are not a burden. They are a constant reminder of the price of the peace I enjoy. Sometime, when the night is very still and the wind blows through the pines surrounding my house, I think that Private Miller, that hollow, frozen boy, never returned from that and that the boy Sammy, who loved the smell of cinnamon, died in that fire. The man sitting in this rocking chair is someone else, someone who was built from the pieces that were left. I've learned that survival isn't a single act of luck, like a tank rolling over your foxhole. It's a process. It's a million small choices made every day for decades. The choice to get out of bed when nightmares drenched you in sweat. The choice to open your heart to another person, knowing the risk it entails. The choice to plant a flower in a land that once knew only blood and ice. The world taught me about indifference, about cruelty, about meaninglessness. But a kind waitress in a roadside diner taught me that the kindness of a single person can be a counterbalance to all the hatred in the world. My children taught me that building a life is the sweetest revenge against those who tried to destroy it. Life, in the end, is not about what is taken from us, but about what we choose to do with what remains. We all carry something, don't we? A small object, a memory, a scent that anchors us to who we were or who we've lost. For me, it was the memory of a mother-of-pearl button buried under a stone, a symbol of a vow I once made to myself and that I've thankfully learned to break. What's your anchor? If you feel comfortable, share in the comments what small memory, object, or sensation reminds you of an important part of your own journey. It's a way for us to bear witness to each other, to not let story, big or small, be lost in silence. Because perhaps that's the only thing that truly matters. I didn't survive the war. I survived the peace that came after. And that, believe me, was the longest battle of all.